High on a gentle rise, at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with neat lawns and white picket fences, sat a quiet suburb known as Brookside Gables. This picturesque neighborhood might have appeared perfect in postcards. Children laughing as they ran across carefully manicured green grass, elderly couples strolling in the late afternoon sun, and small American flags perched on front porches fluttering softly in the breeze. The streets were impeccably clean, the houses built in tidy rows, and the air was often sweet with the smell of fresh-cut grass mingling with barbecue smoke. Behind this veneer of suburban harmony, however, lurked the tension and drama brought by one woman who held an outsized influence on the community, Brenda Karen Barnhurst, though no one dared call her Karen to her face. Brenda Barnhurst was a middle-aged woman, mother of one grown son living out of state, wife of a timid accountant who rarely emerged from the house, and, most controversially, a leading board member of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, HOA. She was known for her impeccable but rigid fashion sense, polo shirts in pastel colors, pressed slacks, hair pinned back neatly, and her insistence on absolute order. She had a starched, precise air about her, from her crisp gestures to the stern line of her mouth. She was the unstoppable force behind any number of minor and major controversies that had shaken Brookside Gables in recent years. Distant barking? She'd be on your doorstep with a dog whistle and a citation. Christmas lights up too long after the holidays? Prepare for a stern letter and an ominous threat of a fine. Pink flamingo lawn ornaments? Don't even think about it. For the most part, the residents of Brookside Gables had learned to tiptoe around Brenda Barnhurst. They abided by the HOA guidelines, or at least disguised any infractions so subtly that Brenda's eagle eyes couldn't detect them. The single mother who lived across from the Barnhursts, for instance, kept her teenage son's basketball hoop folded away in the garage after each game to avoid citations about unsightly sporting equipment. Retired couples dared not place anything beyond the standard flowers and shrubs in their front beds. In essence, everyone grew used to living in Brenda's restrictive world because peace was easier than confrontation. But there was one person who had no desire to cower before an overzealous HOA official, Mr. Harold Patterson. He was a retired electrical engineer in his 70s, with silver hair, a wiry frame, and a kindly face. He had lost his wife a few years earlier, and though he missed her dearly, Harold found a simple comfort in the everyday rhythms of life. One of his cherished rituals was sitting outside on his covered front porch, gently swinging back and forth on a well-worn wooden porch swing that he and his late wife had purchased decades ago. Its painted finish had long since worn away, replaced by a warm patina of age and weather. Every evening, Harold would settle in, letting the day's tension fade as the slant of the sunset cast gentle rays across the porch. The swing creaked softly, almost like a lullaby to him. Its rhythmic squeaks were a memory he refused to part with. Naturally, to Brenda Barnhurst, Karen in spirit and temperament, nothing was more offensive than a squeaky swing. For months, she had glared at Harold from across the street, simmering in private indignation. The gentle eek-eek-eek sound that seemed so musical to Harold was an affront to Brenda's sense of order. She had written him polite but pointed notes. She had left phone messages citing obscure HOA rules about noise disturbances. But Harold Patterson, having once spent a career solving complex electrical problems under the guidance of stern managers, possessed a stubbornness that refused to yield to petty tyranny. Each letter that arrived in his mailbox was politely skimmed and then promptly discarded. He understood that the HOA existed for certain reasons, to keep property values high, to foster a sense of pride in the neighborhood, but he saw no reason an old man couldn't enjoy a beloved piece of porch furniture. And so, as the days wore on, a tension began to build in Brookside Gables. Brenda had found her next cause, and Harold would not budge. For weeks, Brenda tried ramping up the pressure. She posted announcements on the local community board, encouraging people to report unreasonable noise disruptions. She cornered neighbors, leaning in to ask if the squeak from Harold's porch swing had kept them up at night. Most neighbors quickly shook their heads. Some insisted they had never noticed, while others were far too timid to cross Brenda and simply nodded vaguely, not actually wanting to get Harold in trouble. Dissatisfied, Brenda stepped up her campaign. She began patrolling the street more frequently, walking her small yapping dog, a miniature poodle named Precious, in loops around Harold's property. She stood with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the front porch. If Harold so much as put a finger on that swing, she would log the event in a little notepad she carried. What Brenda didn't realize was that the more she tried to strong-arm Harold, the more sympathy he gained from the rest of the community. Many of Brookside Gables' older residents understood how precious small memories could be, particularly of a beloved spouse gone too soon. The younger families, though busy, also recognized that no one wanted to see a kindly elderly neighbor bullied over a mild squeak. In the background, quiet conversations arose about how unfair it was that Brenda always seemed to target people's personal joys. Things escalated one windy day in early summer. White clouds sailed across bright blue skies, and a cheerful breeze rustled the neighborhood's trees. Harold had just finished watering his flower beds. He settled onto his porch swing, slowly letting the seat drift back and forth in that gentle seesaw motion. The breeze carried the faint squeak of the chains. In the distance, he noticed Brenda stomping across the street toward him, Precious trotting behind. The bright sun gleamed against Brenda's hair as she marched, her pressed khaki pants and pastel green polo giving her the look of someone about to lead a country club meeting. Harold recognized the fury in her eyes instantly. She climbed the porch steps without so much as a greeting. "Mr. Patterson," she snapped, "we need to have a discussion about this squeaking menace you call a porch swing." Harold calmly lifted an eyebrow, letting the swing slow to a stop. "Is it that time again, Ms. Barnhurst?" he asked, voice casual. "I thought we'd exhausted this topic." She pursed her lips. "My phone has been ringing off the hook with complaints from the neighbors," Brenda declared, ignoring that this was only half true. "People are tired of hearing that incessant squeak. It might be the middle of the afternoon now, but you're sometimes out here in the evenings too. It's a noise violation." Harold inhaled a breath of patience. He'd heard the spiel before. "I took a poll of my immediate neighbors, Miss Barnhurst. None said they were bothered by the swing. In fact, several told me they have no idea what you're talking about." Brenda's eye twitched in annoyance. "That's just because no one wants to confront you, Mr. Patterson. She waved a hand vaguely at him, as though searching for the right word. "You're very set in your ways, I get that. But we have standards in Brookside Gables. And if you refuse to fix the squeak, then it's time to remove the entire contraption. I have the bylaw right here." With a flourish, she produced a printed piece of paper that evidently quoted some snippet about unreasonable mechanical squeaking. Harold suspected that this was no official bylaw, but rather an interpretive stretch from a clause about mechanical equipment or general noise rules. He forced a polite smile, though inside he felt an old, familiar stubborn streak flare up. "Ms. Barnhurst, I've lived here for 30 years. That swing has been here longer than you've even known this neighborhood existed. If it squeaks, it squeaks. I'm happy to put some oil on the chain, but it's not going anywhere." Brenda's face hardened, her lips thinning into a line that rivaled the tension in the chain's squeak. "I'm warning you," she said quietly. "Don't test me on this." Then she snapped her fingers at Precious, turned on her heel, and marched back down the steps in a swirl of indignation. Over the next few days, word spread about the confrontation. Some neighbors quietly admitted to Harold they found it ridiculous that Brenda was so obsessed with removing his porch swing. Others gave supportive nods or dropped off small tokens, like freshly baked cookies or discreet notes that read, "We're with you, Harold." Meanwhile, Brenda patrolled the street more fiercely than ever, determined to catch Harold in the act of noise. Pollution. Even so, the tension didn't truly erupt until one Saturday morning, when Harold had gone to visit his sister in a neighboring town for brunch. Nobody witnessed the moment Brenda stormed up onto Harold's property with a small set of wrenches and pliers in hand. Under normal circumstances, an HOA board member interfering physically with someone else's property would have been unthinkable. But to Brenda, Harold's refusal to comply with her demands had reached a tipping point. She took one look at the old, beloved wooden swing, chains lightly rattling in the wind, and decided enough was enough. With the fierce intensity of someone who believed they were saving the neighborhood, she attacked the screws and bolts that held the swing in place. She fiddled with the chain bracket until it came loose from the porch's crossbeam. The old swing, suddenly freed of its moorings, dropped with a startling thud onto the porch floor. In her rush, Brenda lost her grip on one bracket. It clattered to the boards near her feet. With remarkable strength fueled by righteous indignation, Brenda heaved the battered seat off the porch. One of the wooden slats cracked from the strain. She then dragged it across the lawn, leaving shallow furrows through the grass. By the time she finished, the porch swing was lying in a crooked heap at the curb, almost as if it were garbage waiting for pickup. Satisfied, Brenda wiped sweat from her brow, tossed her hair back, and marched away. When Harold arrived home that afternoon, his heart nearly stopped. He pulled into his driveway, thinking he must have turned onto the wrong street, because he saw no swing on his porch. Instead, he saw splinters of wood and a few bolts scattered across the boards. He leapt from his car and rushed to investigate, only to discover the old swing lying in the front yard, broken nearly in half. He felt a twisting pain in his chest, as though someone had seized a cherished family heirloom and shattered it before his eyes. Word spread faster than wildfire. Several neighbors ventured onto Harold's lawn the moment they saw him return, offering their shocked condolences. One woman explained she'd noticed Brenda creeping onto the porch with tools earlier, but by the time the neighbor realized Brenda was forcibly removing the swing, it was already in pieces. They tried to call Harold's phone, but he was out of service range at his sister's remote countryside home. For a moment, Harold stood in silence over the remains of his porch swing. He swallowed the lump in his throat. The sentimental value far outweighed the monetary worth. This was the swing he and his wife had purchased together, the swing in which they'd spent lazy Sunday evenings sipping iced tea, the swing that had lulled him in quiet reflection after she passed. Now it lay in a broken heap, courtesy of an HOA bully who had declared it a nuisance. Brenda emerged from her house across the street, wearing a triumphant, almost smug expression. Her stance radiated a sense of, "I told you so." Harold steadied himself. Rage simmered inside him, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of an outburst. He called out across the street, voice trembling with barely contained anger, "What gave you the right?" She straightened her shoulders. "You refused to comply with our neighborhood standards. The squeak was driving me insane. I enforced the rules, Mr. Patterson, as I am entitled to do." Harold took a step forward, fists clenched. "That was my property. You had no legal authority to destroy it." Brenda lifted her chin defiantly. "In my position with the HOA, I have the right to remove or rectify property elements that violate our guidelines, especially if they create a noise hazard or pose a structural risk. That swing was old, unsafe, and it was driving me and countless others to distraction." The neighbors who had gathered muttered among themselves, outraged at Brenda's audacity. One middle-aged man, a local teacher named Gary, shook his head and said, "You've gone too far this time, Brenda. This was criminal trespass at best." Unfazed, Brenda shot him a glare. "Criminal trespass? Hardly. If you bothered to read the bylaws, you'd see we have every right to remove hazardous or disruptive items. I'm only doing my job." Harold's emotions warred inside him. Anger, sorrow, disbelief. "You destroyed something precious to me," he said softly, glancing at the battered swing. "I won't stand for this. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." With that, he gently gathered the pieces of his swing. Neighbors tried to help, picking up splintered wooden slats, bent bolts, the broken chain. One older woman placed a comforting hand on Harold's shoulder, tears in her own eyes. She remembered how Harold's wife would always smile and wave from that very porch. Now, it was all lost to the single-minded vendetta of one Karen in the neighborhood. Brenda stood there with arms crossed, radiating self-satisfaction. But she failed to see the quiet fury building in the faces around her. She was so sure she had won this battle, so convinced of her moral high ground. That evening, Harold sat in his living room, the remnants of the swing laid out in the garage. He intended to file a police report. In fact, he'd already called the authorities, but they informed him that, in matters of property disputes in HOA communities, the lines could get murky. Harold recognized this was going to be a complicated process, yet he refused to be intimidated. Meanwhile, neighbor after neighbor showed up at his front door. They brought dinner casseroles, offers of legal advice, or simply their condolences. One older couple, the Johnsons, who had lived near Harold for over 2 decades, sat with him over cups of coffee. "You know," Mrs. Johnson said, dabbing her eyes, "I remember seeing you and your wife out on that swing. I'm just so sorry." Harold let out a ragged sigh. "I can't believe it's gone." Mr. Johnson placed a hand on Harold's arm. Look, we're all behind you. The neighborhood is fed up with her nonsense. Maybe we can do more than just complain about it. How about we band together and do something right for once? This sparked an idea that spread among the neighbors. They decided to buy Harold a new porch swing. But not just any swing. One that would be top of the line, with new silent bearings, so Brenda couldn't complain about squeaking. Over the next few days, a hush-hush fundraising campaign started. People chipped in whatever they could spare, some money, some materials, some labor. Gary, the teacher, offered to gather all contributions. The local carpenter volunteered to build a custom seat, if needed. Others reached out to a specialized shop that produced sturdy, squeak-free porch swings designed with advanced pivot bearings. The news of these quiet efforts didn't take long to reach Brenda, but she remained steadfastly convinced she had the right to refuse Harold any new porch swing, especially if it could be considered unapproved design. She sent Harold an official letter demanding he submit a request for new porch furniture. She threatened additional fines if the color or style clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. Despite her attempts, the wheels were already in motion. A wave of solidarity surged through the neighborhood. The more Brenda threatened, the more people felt determined to see Harold get a new swing that would serve as a kind of symbolic victory over her tyranny. At last, a crisp Saturday morning arrived with plans fully formed. Gary knocked on Harold's door, bright-eyed and excited. "Harold, good news. We pooled enough money to buy you the perfect swing, and the final donations came in last night." Harold blinked in surprise. "You folks didn't have to do that." I hardly know what to say." Gary smiled. "Say yes." The new swing was something special, carefully chosen from a store that specialized in ergonomic designs and silent bearings. Over the next few hours, neighbors gathered in Harold's garage to help piece it together. The wood was a warm, honey-colored cedar, sealed to resist weather. The chain's bearings were cleverly insulated so that not even a faint squeak would escape. By mid-afternoon, the new swing was assembled, tested, and ready to be installed on Harold's porch, this time with reinforced supports that met every code known to man, ensuring Brenda couldn't claim it was unsafe. Brenda watched the bustle from across the street, arms folded. Several times, her front door would open, Precious barking at the flurry of neighbors heading up Harold's driveway. Each time, she peered through the crack in her door with open disapproval. She hated feeling left out or overshadowed, and the entire block seemed united in celebrating Harold's new addition. By dusk, the swing was mounted securely. Harold, exhausted but deeply touched, carefully lowered himself onto it. The seat moved soundlessly as he gently rocked back and forth. The breeze caught the cedar's scent, carrying it across the porch. A hush fell across the small crowd gathered on his lawn. They smiled as Harold tested it out, their hearts warmed by the look of gratitude on his face. "It's beautiful," he said softly, voice catching. "It really is." A smattering of applause broke out. The hush was replaced by cheerful chatter. People lingered, wanting to see him enjoy this moment. And then, someone suggested an impromptu celebration. Why not hold a small porch swing social? Right here, with everyone bringing lemonade or sweet tea, homemade cookies, brownies, whatever they had at home, just to mark the occasion. Within the hour, neighbors had set up folding tables on Harold's lawn. Some children played tag in the street, supervised by watchful adults. Pitchers of lemonade and iced tea glistened with condensation in the warm evening air. Plates were piled high with homemade treats. Even the local ice cream truck, upon hearing the commotion, swung by and played cheerful tunes to entice the gathering. Harold, seated on his new swing, found himself greeted by a steady stream of neighbors offering well wishes. He felt overwhelmed by the sense of community, something he hadn't truly experienced in years, especially after losing his wife. The generosity of these people, who banded together to stand up to Brenda, filled him with hope. Brenda, however, was not in a festive mood. She had received an invitation, scrawled politely by one of the neighbor's children, who believed it would be rude to exclude anyone. But in her eyes, this was a direct challenge to her authority. How dare they hold a social gathering celebrating the installation of something she had explicitly opposed? She huffed and glared out the window. Precious yapped furiously whenever children ran across the front yard next door. Finally, after an hour of internal debate, Brenda could bear it no longer. She marched out of her house, stepped onto Harold's lawn, and cleared her throat loudly. The lively chatter quieted as people turned to see her. Some braced themselves for a confrontation, while others watched with mild dread. Harold, still rocking gently on his squeak-free swing, looked up to meet her gaze. "Care for a glass of lemonade, Miss Barnhurst?" he asked, voice measured. Brenda's nostrils flared, but she forced an icy smile. "That's quite all right, Mr. Patterson," she said. "I'm here on official HOA business to inform you that this porch swing has not been approved by the board. I'll need the design specifications, the color chart, and a formal request. Additionally, I must remind you that large gatherings on front lawns, involving tables, food, and music, may require a permit." A ripple of exasperated groans swept through the crowd. One of the teenage neighbors sarcastically quipped, "Yeah, big lemonade stands can be real menaces to society." Brenda glared at the teen. "This is serious. We have rules in Brookside Gables, and I expect them to be followed. If you want to hold a social event, you need to submit a request form at least 2 weeks prior. Otherwise, it's considered unauthorized." Gary, the teacher, stepped forward, expression calm. "Ms. Barnhurst, with all due respect, we're here in support of Mr. Patterson. We're not creating noise beyond typical conversation. We're not blocking the roads, and this is private property. The fact that you destroyed his previous swing was overreach, to say the least. Everyone here knows it." A few heads nodded firmly. Another neighbor chimed in. "And this new swing meets every standard. We made sure of it." Brenda's eyes narrowed. She turned to Harold, leveling a finger at him. "You're stirring up trouble, Mr. Patterson. You might have these people fooled, but I see what's really going on. You're all trying to undermine the HOA's authority. The rules are in place for a reason." Harold took a slow breath, determined to maintain composure. "We're not undermining anything. We simply want to live peacefully without arbitrary enforcement of made-up rules. This swing doesn't squeak. It's structurally sound, meets code, and is no eyesore. That's all we ever wanted, Ms. Barnhurst." A silence hung in the air, crackling with tension. For a moment, it seemed Brenda might lash out again. Her face was splotchy, fists clenched. Then a new voice cut in. "You know, Brenda, we tried to do this fairly." It was one of the older women who'd lived there for decades. She'd known Harold and his wife well. "We've been respectful, but you went too far. This is just a neighborhood social, dear. Let's keep it friendly." The woman offered Brenda a glass of lemonade. Brenda hesitated, her face flickering with conflicting emotions: anger, indignation, and perhaps a hint of embarrassment. She shoved the glass away, causing lemonade to slosh onto the grass. "I won't be a part of this charade," she hissed. "But don't think this is over. The HOA has guidelines, and I intend to see them enforced. If you all insist on defying me, then you can deal with the consequences." With that, she whirled on her heel and stormed back across the street, Precious yipping beside her. The crowd exhaled collectively, attention releasing as soon as Brenda had gone. Then they turned back to Harold, raising cups of lemonade in a silent toast of solidarity. Days passed. Brenda made good on her promise to file complaints about Harold's new swing and the unauthorized porch gathering. But every official channel she pursued hit a dead end. The new swing's design was, indeed, within permissible standards. The color was neutral. The gathering was small enough that local authorities saw no reason to intervene. Meanwhile, the rest of the HOA board, tired of Brenda's constant drama, refused to take up her cause. A few board members had privately told her to stand down, pointing out that she was making the association look ridiculous. That only fueled her indignation. She tried passing new guidelines that specifically banned porch swings unless they were silent from a distance of 10 yards or more. She attempted to impose arbitrary porch usage times, hoping to keep Harold from swinging in the evenings. None of these proposals gained traction. Neighbors knew exactly why such regulations were being proposed and unanimously voted them down whenever possible. In a last-ditch effort, Brenda began peppering local law enforcement with noise complaints, claiming the squeak had returned. Each time, an officer would drive by, windows rolled down, only to hear nothing. The new swing was nearly silent, save for an almost imperceptible whisper of metal on metal. The officers, exasperated, eventually stopped responding to her calls. Around the neighborhood, support for Harold quietly grew. Folks who previously tolerated Brenda's antics realized the line had been crossed. If she could invade a porch and destroy an old man's cherished memories, she could do anything. Individuals began speaking up in HOA meetings, pushing back against her heavy-handed approach. One Sunday, to Brenda's horror, Harold's front lawn once again filled with neighbors. This time, they had organized a monthly porch swing social in Harold's honor, an event planned to occur on the last Sunday of every month with some light refreshments. Each time, they'd gather around Harold's new swing and simply talk, share stories, or watch the sunset. Some nights, a local musician would strum a guitar. Others, people would bring picnic blankets for children to play. Harold, deeply moved, quietly believed that the generosity and spirit of the community was in many ways a gift from his late wife, who had always been kind and open-hearted. Brenda inevitably appeared at each gathering, seething from across the street, arms crossed, Precious barking incessantly. But more and more, the neighbors gave her little attention. They'd grown weary of her confrontation. And with each porch swing social, Harold found himself surrounded by companionship he never expected. He had been so lonely after his wife's passing, living in a largely quiet house, only able to reflect on memories. Now, people approached him for conversation, asked about his life, included him in their joys and sorrows. One evening, after the third monthly porch gathering, the sky was turning soft shades of pink and orange. The last of the neighbors drifted away, leaving Harold alone on the swing, enjoying the tranquil hush that comes after a friendly gathering. He rocked gently, hearing only the faintest rustle of the chain. Over the last few months, the bitterness of losing his original swing had eased, replaced by gratitude for a community that had gone out of its way to show him kindness. He was about to stand and head inside when he glimpsed a figure on the sidewalk, Brenda, alone, with Precious nowhere in sight. Harold tensed, wondering if she planned another confrontation. But to his surprise, her posture seemed different, less rigid, shoulders somewhat slumped. She hesitated a moment, then slowly approached the porch steps. Harold waited quietly, unsure of her intentions. Up close, he noticed the lines of tension on her face. She looked as though she'd been wrestling with turmoil for days. A flicker of vulnerability crossed her features. "What can I do for you?" Harold asked, his tone cautious but not unkind. Brenda pressed her lips together. It seemed like she wanted to speak, but didn't know where to begin. At last, she exhaled. I spoke with the HOA board. They said they're not going to pursue the porch swing matter further." Harold gave a slow nod. "I assumed as much." She glanced away, fiddling with her hands. "I just wanted to say that if the swing is truly silent and meets standards, well, I won't cause any more fuss about it." Harold felt a twinge of curiosity. This was as close to an apology as Brenda Barnhurst might ever come. The old him might have told her to scram, but his wife had always insisted that peace was better than resentment. So he offered a small concession. "I appreciate you letting it go." Brenda shifted on her feet. "I only did what I did because I believed it was my duty. This neighborhood matters to me." Harold wondered if she was sincere or simply rationalizing, but he decided to respond gently. "Brookside Gables matters to all of us. We can keep it beautiful and welcoming without tearing each other's property apart." She studied him, her face struggling between pride and regret. "Perhaps," she said at last. Then she turned and left, not offering so much as a goodbye. Harold sat there a while, letting the tension of the exchange fade, listening to the night settle. Her half-apology or whatever it was might not make up for the destruction of his old swing, but maybe it signaled a softened stance. Over the following weeks, the porch swing social events continued. Brenda did not attend, but she also stopped launching immediate attacks. She occasionally sent out an email reminding people of the finer points of the HOA guidelines, but her personal crusade had lost its steam. Meanwhile, Harold found that the new swing, silent though it was, began to feel like a worthy heir to the old one. Its seat had the same cozy curve. In moments of reflection, he felt his wife's memory more vividly than ever, now connected with the warmth of neighbors rallying to his defense. At times, Harold would catch Brenda peeking out of her window, a strange expression on her face. It was neither the old triumphant glare nor the smug superiority. Instead, she seemed lonely, perhaps even wistful. He wondered if, deep down, she missed being part of a real community. If in her obsession with controlling everything, she'd built her own cage, isolating herself from the friendships that made neighborhoods thrive. Months drifted by. Seasons changed. Summer gave way to a bright autumn, with red and gold leaves swirling across sidewalks. Then winter arrived, bringing holiday decorations that once again tested Brenda's resolve. Though by then, the other board members kept her impulses in check. They insisted that the holiday spirit should be celebrated, reminding Brenda that not every extension cord or wreath required an official permit. Throughout these transitions, Harold's porch swing remained. He'd added a thick cushion for colder nights, and he found the crisp winter air strangely comforting. The hush of the season made the swing's silent bearings all the more evident. Sometimes he could almost sense the old squeak in his mind, a tender memory of the seat that once was. But the new swing had a presence of its own, an emblem of a community that, in the end, refused to stand by while an elderly neighbor was bullied. Even the local newspaper heard about the incident. A small piece was published in the local happenings section, recounting how a meddlesome HOA board member had forcibly removed a senior's porch swing, only to see the neighborhood unite behind him and provide a replacement. Spirit of Brookside Gables triumphs over HOA tyranny, read the subheading. The article mentioned no names, but the entire community knew exactly who was who. Harold occasionally glanced across the street at Brenda's house, pondering the chain of events. She had gone to such lengths to remove what she considered a nuisance, only to have the neighbors respond by gifting him something better. He sensed that, beneath her prickly veneer, something might have cracked in her worldview. Because she rarely confronted him now, rarely summoned the old aggression. Nevertheless, Karen was still Karen. She couldn't fully shed her need to meddle, her sense of self-importance. But the power dynamic had shifted. Everyone in Brookside Gables understood that her reign of intimidation had limits. People no longer cowered before her, nor were they overly impressed by her endless references to the HOA bylaws. Instead, they maintained a polite but firm distance, refusing to enable her sense of control. One brisk spring day, about a year after the initial porch swing fiasco, Harold found himself once again out on the porch, rocking gently. The new swing still looked pristine, thanks to the occasional coat of protective varnish. A light breeze stirred the fresh buds on the trees. He watched as Brenda, wearing a navy tracksuit, took Precious for a walk around the cul-de-sac. She paused near Harold's mailbox, presumably letting Precious sniff the curb. Their gazes met. She offered a curt nod, which Harold returned. Then, in a quiet, timid voice, Brenda called out, "Lovely day." Harold nodded again. "Indeed it is." She lingered awkwardly, as if wanting to say something else, but she ultimately moved on. Harold saw something like regret flicker in her eyes. Perhaps she remembered how drastically she had interfered with someone else's life. Maybe she recalled the community's backlash. The details remained unspoken, but that fleeting look told Harold all he needed to know. She recognized that her crusade had cost her a chance to be part of the neighborhood's stronger sense of unity. Meanwhile, life went on for Brookside Gables. Children grew older, families moved in and out, holiday decorations brightened winter nights, summer barbecues dotted driveways with the smell of grilling burgers. And through it all, Harold continued rocking on his porch swing. No squeaks, no complaints, just a gentle motion that spoke of contentment. At the next porch swing social, neighbors gathered around with a sense of camaraderie that had become tradition. Harold smiled as he sipped lemonade, remembering how, a year ago, he'd felt devastated by the destruction of his treasured seat. Now, the new swing was a symbol of resilience, a daily reminder that good neighbors, united, could overcome one meddlesome Karen. As the sky changed into a soft watercolor of pink and gold, Harold reached up to touch the edge of the porch beam, where the swing hung. He recalled the time spent with his wife on the old swing, the big moments and the small. This new seat bore no squeaks, only the hush of silent bearings. But in that hush, there was something magical. Perhaps it was the echo of laughter, the memory of a kind gesture, or the promise that even in suburban America, where many lead private lives behind neatly trimmed hedges, people could still show up for one another in moments of crisis. And so ended the saga of Brenda Karen Barnhurst's attempt to rid the neighborhood of Harold Patterson's swinging seat. She succeeded only in galvanizing the community, forging stronger bonds among neighbors, and upgrading Harold's porch swing to something even more treasured. Over time, the story of the forcibly removed swing became a small legend within Brookside Gables, recounted to new residents as a cautionary tale about what happens when an HOA board member oversteps. The moral that circulated was simple: don't be a Karen, be a neighbor. Harold, for his part, gained more than he lost. Though he would never forget the sentimental value of the original swing, he found comfort in the knowledge that he was not alone. Even in a sleepy cul-de-sac policed by an overzealous HOA, community spirit could triumph over pettiness. And each evening, as he gently rocked on that silent porch swing, he felt a sense of peace, the memory of his wife mingling with the quiet hum of friendly voices that so often stopped by to join him. In the end, Karen's meltdown had netted Harold far more than she could ever have imagined. New friends, new memories, and a brand new, squeak-free porch swing. Proof that sometimes, the best answer to tyranny is a community that won't be bullied and a heart that won't stop finding joy in the simplest of comforts.